recent U.S. housing collapse, credit crunch, rising food and fuel costs are contributing to an economic crisis that many say is pushing the economy into recession. Some suggest that the solution is to make economic institutions more accountable and transparent. The Real News Network's senior editor Paul Jay sat down with Professor of Political Economy Leo Panitch to discuss possible solutions to the current economic crisis.
Leo, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Paul.
Last time we talked, we discussed that there's a fundamental structural problem in the United States and American economy, and not just the American economy, that so much of the consumer demand is actually driven by consumer debt, to a large extent because wages are lower, unions are weak, and how much wealth has been transferred from the majority of ordinary people to a very tiny section at the top. Start just kind of recap what that's about, and then let's move into what can be done.
Well, I think the fundamental question is whether the way in which people have been able to maintain their standards of living and even increase their consumption, which they have over the last 30 years since the Reagan neoliberal, neoconservative revolution, they have increased their standard of living, but they've done it on the basis of consumer debt, on credit cards, on mortgages, etc. They've done it on the basis of working longer hours and more members of the family working. They've done it on the basis of working multiple jobs and increasingly casualized and insecure jobs. But consumer debt has been an enormous part of it, as the back of the organized working class, the trade unions, was broken, beginning in the early 80s with these Chrysler concessions and the air traffic controllers union being broken by Reagan and so on.
When I was a kid, it was not uncommon for an ordinary working person, a unionized ordinary working person, to have a small house in the city and own a cottage.
Yeah.
And it was true in much of North America that was the case. And often people compare then to now. That now is far much more of a struggle for ordinary people than it was back in the 50s.
It's a struggle to hold on to those things, that's true, and people hold on to them via getting into debt. I think that's right. I think it has to be said that at the same time, people to some extent have bought into this. They've been prepared to live on the basis of increased debt and insecurity, provided they are able to get those goods that our advertising tells them in the mainstream media that the good life depends upon. They have allowed their pension plans to be run into the banking system, into the speculative system that produced this prime mortgage crisis. They've been in this rat race looking for individualized solutions as they've lost the collective solutions to their problems. And the question I raised last time we talked was whether the limits of this had been reached in the United States, whether the current crisis indicates that keeping the system going through providing debt to consumers in the United States to keep on in this rat race has reached its end, and then what a way out there might be in the face of this.
With the thousands into millions of foreclosures, there's talk in the United States of the drop in real estate prices being even greater than the drop in real estate prices during the 1930s. The repercussions on ordinary people are going to be very profound if all this comes to pass. What change, and this election's all about change. Let's have real change, of course every election talks about that.
Right.
What would real change look like?
Well, it depends which side of the fence you're on in terms of the class struggle, I guess. Although I think a lot of people on the side of the fence I'd like to be them on, would not like the type of proposals I'd put forward. They'd appear too radical to them. Insofar as freedom is understood in the United States in terms of the freedom of property owners to do what they want with property that is really the legacy of generations of contributions that a whole range of people made, but it ends up in the hands of property owners, usually large banks and corporations that control most of the investment decisions, the decisions about what jobs are going to be created, how much people are going to be paid, where they're going to be created, and so on. Those things need to be democratized. It is quite astonishing, and most people know it, that what matters to them is not so much the election every 4 years. What really matters to them is where they're going to have a job, what kind of public infrastructure exists in their city, and so on. And that's decided much, much more by the enormous financial and industrial corporations that control those decisions.
So if you're, what would it mean? What's an example of what it would mean to democratize, and how would you pay for it?
It's an old story that if we're going to have fundamental change, we would have to not only have a democratic polity, but a democratic economy. Ultimately, that means that the big corporations and banks ought to be subject to democratic election, representation, accountability. One isn't going to get there quickly given the power of those forces, especially in the United States, that control those institutions. So one has to think of the types of reforms that could build to further reforms. And unfortunately, even a lot of the New Deal reforms were of a kind that were on a one-off kind, were of a kind that protected people, set up regulatory commissions, but weren't the type of reforms that led on to democratizing the banks.
Well,
and that's what we need to look for.
We're going to end this part one, and with part two, we're going to get more into what might these reforms look like.
Let's try to do that.